All right. Well, thanks very much. Thank you, Stuart, for the introduction. Thank you to everyone for joining us for our presentation today. As you heard, I'm Thomas Malaby, professor here at UWM, and with me is Ryan House. Ryan and I will be handing the virtual microphone back and forth to see if this works. We'll be attempting to introduce, illustrate, and explore some of our thoughts about games and what we're calling the digitally natural. So we'll be combining ideas from a piece I'm working on about how we may explore remediation in digital games, along with the streaming of 3 games that have been chosen by Ryan, and he'll be giving his commentary when he's doing that. Now, Ryan and I have shared an interest in what one might call the phenomenological side of game studies research, that is, in the experience of games, both analog and digital, by players. Alongside this is another interest we share, and that is in the institutionalized contexts in which all gaming takes place. The ideas we'll be talking about today come from our conversations, as well as from a chapter I'm contributing to a new volume in media anthropology. Now, the editors invited the contributors to consider the concept of remediation. I was excited to do it, as it seemed to be a great opportunity to develop further some thoughts about how many of the elements of analog games that are often quite explicit and explicitly contrived, and I'm thinking of things like written rules, random generators, materiality of different kinds, become, through remediation of a particular sort, implicit in the context of most digital games. Now, for scholars interested in games, there has been a vexed fault line that has appeared to separate treatments of so-called analog or offline games from digital games. How should those interested in understanding digitally remediated games, their uses, and their impact handle this dimension of their subject, especially when many games and game-like phenomena really sit astride this boundary? What would an approach to the digital aspect of games today, one that refuses an a priori categorical distinction between the analog and the digital, look like? In what is in part the inspiration for our work, the anthropologist David Graeber discusses this fault line briefly when he meditates on how Dungeons and Dragons resides in between, on the one hand, the bureaucratically ordered structures of their rule systems and printed statistical resources, and, on the other, the contingency of their imaginative social play. He goes on to raise questions about the digital remediation of game elements in the games that followed in D&D's wake, in the quotes here. Quote, D&D, as its aficionados call it, is on one level the most free-form game imaginable. However, in another sense, D&D represents the ultimate bureaucratization of anti-bureaucratic fantasy. The books are largely composed of statistics. It's also true that in actual play there are no rules. The books are just guidelines. The dungeon master can, and indeed really ought to, play around with them. The numbers are in a sense a platform for crazy feats of the imagination. Still, the introduction of numbers, the standardization of types of character, ability, monster, treasure, spell, the concept of ability scores, and hit points had profound effects when one moved from the world of 6, 8, 12, and 20-sided dice, don't really know why he leaves 4-sided out, to the one of digital interfaces. Computer games could turn fantasy into an almost entirely bureaucratic procedure, accumulation of points, the raising of levels, and so on, unquote. Graeber here has seized upon a transformation of media that demands our attention, a transformation of previously explicit elements into the veiled computation of code. Graeber's treatment, however, as seen in this extended quote, tends toward a dichotomy. Weberian rational bureaucracy stands on one side, with the anarchy of free imagination on the other. What he does not take up is how analog game elements, in this case the dice, which occupy center stage, actually lie somewhere between these extremes. Neither bureaucratically determinative nor unbounded in their possibility, dice in D&D are tools for generating stochastic contingencies, a kind of indeterminacy that, it should be noted, is anathema to bureaucracy and to digital computation, strictly understood. In D&D, these stochastic contingencies circulate with other sources of the indeterminate, for example, player and DM performance and their guesswork about each other, and they do so alongside the constraints the games impose. But even these constraints, we must remember, are not simply rules, that is, the bureaucratic, in other forms. The material or architectural are their own kind of constraint, as are the social conventions that shape participants' behavior. With this in mind, Graeber's meditation on the shift from the analog to the digital for D&D takes on new dimensions. Rather than a ping-ponging back and forth between bureaucracy and imagination, we begin to notice first that all games may be best understood as striking a balance between pattern and contingency. And second, that analog games often have had to present their contrivance in explicit ways, especially when it comes to elements that allow for the generation of the specifically stochastic indeterminacies games often make use of. Well-shuffled decks of cards, spinners, and dice are just the most familiar examples of game design elements vital for the production of contingency beyond that introduced by players' actions and guesses. The point that scholarship on games has yet to consider is what happens when these elements, as well as constraints such as architecture, social convention, and rule systems, are remediated in the context of digital and digitally networked technologies. To put it bluntly, does the experience of playing games that have increasingly implicit constraints and contingencies transform the impact they can have on the dispositions they cultivate, as well as the related claims they make about the real? And here I'll turn to Ryan, who I think has a basketball game up and streaming.
We are watching a basketball game. So right now we're watching a simulated match between, actually right now we're watching the Laker girls at half court. But I can hit X a few times. And we'll get back to a simulated basketball game between the Lakers and the Heat, I believe. So while Thomas and I were working on some of these ideas, I've been watching a lot of NCAA basketball with March Madness and whatnot. And I've really started getting interested in the instant replay affordance that the parameters of the NCAA allows for in order to be more precise in calls made on the floor, right? It's an effort to get it really happened. It's an attempt to reinforce the legitimacy of the proceedings and thus the NCAA or the NBA in this case. And so it got me thinking, if precise adherence to the rules increases legitimacy, then is not a basketball game sim, where rules are enforced by the omniscient procedural architecture, the place to experience a real game of basketball? And I know it's the case, particularly with games like Madden, that for a while, simulations in Madden had a pretty good track record of predicting Super Bowl winners in the NFL. And so there really does seem to be this sort of idea that we can get at this really real thing through this simulation. Now, I'm really interested in what happens when I take over. So I'm going to be taking over for the side of the Lakers. And we see immediately... We see immediately that the camera changes, right? First, we had this really great remediation of television broadcasting. And what you couldn't hear is some of the announcers' broadcasts that I muted for the presentation, including players like Shaquille O'Neal. But that's not quite the remediation that we're interested in here. We're interested in looking at the ways that contingencies and mechanics become remediated once games become digital. So as I'm playing the game myself, I have to ask what happens to the experience of basketball, right? And I would wager that for everyone else it gets less real, but for me it gets much more real. And this sort of brings up a question of simulation versus simulator, and I hope you can sense some echoes of Ville's sim racing talk from yesterday, Baudrillard and the simulacrum. So I doubt anyone would bet on or against either team, based on how well this game goes for me. But yet a player might feel that they've beaten the Bucks because the computer uses realistic stats. There were no blown calls and whatnot. So in a way, that player feels like they are actually playing an NBA game. And it really reminds me of an example yesterday someone brought up in chat about a Formula One driver and their disabled brother, I believe, who is big on the e-racing circuit. And I think we can all imagine maybe a conversation between those two brothers about who is the better driver. Taking a quick look at the settings here. And this is not quite all of the settings that this game provides for you, but it does give this idea of the way that even though The game does sort of give us this look at the way that these games are remediated. They're still quite abstracted, right? And if you want to get into the more minutia details, those are going to be really sort of hidden back at in sort of a narrow corner of the game in some settings. So we have them hidden away. They're still abstracted, you know. I can put the difficulty as all-star, superstar, what have you, but it doesn't really tell me exactly how the game is going to go about facilitating these processes, right? And we want to make sure that we really sort of highlight this difference between what we see as rules and what we see as the parameters of the game's architecture, right? The way that the game allows those rules to play out.
Now, in a similar way, Take Back Illinois, which has really long been one of my favorite examples for many things interesting about digital games. Take Back Illinois raised these issues some years ago. In Bogo's single-player, Flash-based game was produced for the Illinois House Republican campaign of 2004. Players encountered the game on the campaign's website, and 4 versions, that is, subgames, of the game were released, 3 of them about specific policy positions. In these policy subgames, there's one here, the player was presented with a few city blocks, or the state, depending on the version, in 2.5D, as well as with slider-like controls, several blocks of information, and a calendar representing time marching on. In the subgame, built in relation to the party's policies on capping medical malpractice awards, seen here, several hospitals were prominent on the landscape, and avatars of residents could be seen moving about, each with an emoji over their heads indicating happiness, dissatisfaction, or illness. The ill residents could infect others as they walked about the city, and hospitals were open only if doctors were available and incented to work in them. The sliders represented simple metrics for medical research support and maximum non-economic damages. And I have to admit, I've presented on this game a number of times since 2004, and the meaning of it has taken on new dimensions in the current moment. Bogo's own discussion of his game focuses on the potential games have for modeling complex systems and reflecting ideologies, which they certainly do have. But for the purposes of this presentation, this game illustrates the remediation of game design elements in a way that parallels what we have just seen with basketball. While its maker has framed its political action as a kind of persuasion, that is, as a rhetorical move taking place in a different guise, we would like to suggest that this and other games that make use of implicit game elements operate much more like ritual. Rather than make an argument, they attempt to enact and verify a particular reality. What becomes particularly interesting when approached in this way is a further complication that games, unlike most ritual, bring to the fore. And that is the enlistment of the participants, that is the players, performance as part of the enactment of a proposed reality. But before we turn to ideas from the study of ritual, let's consider remediation a bit more deeply. In their book, Remediation, Bolter and Grusin devote a chapter to computer games and focus their discussion primarily on the ways in which computer games remediate elements from TV, film, and computers themselves. This is an understandable emphasis and is consistent with treatments of remediation elsewhere in the book. One of its effects, however, is that the discussion of player experience tends to hinge upon questions of visual fidelity and verisimilitude. In fact, the player is regularly replaced with the viewer. At several points, the authors do make note of the player's intimate involvement with the computer game through their input, but the overall discussion is framed with reference to television and film and the associations of these technologies with surveillance and monitoring. The first passage here is representative. Quote, in the 1980s, first arcade games and then video and computer games began to exploit three-dimensional graphics and so to define a space that could be continuous with the user. Designers could then make the game remediate not only the monitoring function of all video, but also the narrative functions of television and film, unquote. In this visual approach, 2 phenomena are central. Hypermediacy, quote, a style of visual representation whose goal is to remind the viewer of the medium, unquote, and transparent immediacy, quote, a style of visual representation whose goal is to make the viewer forget the presence of the medium, unquote. Grusin and Bolter join anthropologists in recognizing that, as we discuss in a few minutes, at stake in the enactment of cultural forms like ritual and game is the construction of the real. But here this seems to be accomplished primarily through the transformation of visual experience, as seen also in the second quote here. Quote, Such games seek the real, sometimes through transparency and sometimes through hypermediacy, sometimes by encouraging the player to look through the surface of the screen, and sometimes by dwelling on the surface with its multiplicity of mediated objects." Unquote. Notably, however, they do begin their chapter with an acknowledgement of how computer games remediate elements, and not necessarily visual ones, from games themselves. And it is this aspect of remediation that we suggest could be especially fruitful for scholarly examinations of digital games. In fact, a consideration of games beyond the visual suggests that, rather than transparent immediacy, the concept of hypomediacy may for games pair particularly well with Gruson and Bolter's hypermediacy. That is to say, at stake in this implicit incorporation of game design elements in digital games is something more than transparent immediacy for a viewer. It is instead the naturalization of the game's arbitrariness for its player. Without taking anything away from how productive examinations of computer games in terms of narrative, film, and television have proven themselves to be, we recommend that we explore what kinds of game-specific remediations are happening in digital games so that we can better recognize the constitution of this really real. To do so requires that we think broadly about both the ways constraints are produced in games, as well as how the various sources of contingency are contrived. Explicit mechanisms, that is, written rules, concretely bounded fields of play, and stochastic mechanisms, have played a central role in the history of games for millennia. They have been central to the ways in which games, rather than representing a starkly cordoned-off arena wherein things unfold in unique ways, instead configure and contrive, within arenas that are at most semi-bounded, the same types of constraints and contingencies that we encounter in our relatively unbounded experience elsewhere. Games that command our attention, as opposed to games that fail, are games that calibrate pattern and the unexpected just so, as Natasha Dalshul has demonstrated most starkly in her work on the production of video poker and slot machines. And we had a nice reference and shout out to Natasha's work yesterday as well. But in most analog games, throughout most of human history, these contrivances have been three things: obvious, participatory, and vulgar in the original sense. That is to say, rules are learned, applied, and enforced. Game spaces are constructed and maintained, and mechanisms that generate contingency, including and beyond the player's own contingent performance, are explicitly deployed and manipulated. In the games we're discussing today, as in virtually all computer games, these processes are, instead, at work implicitly and in various ways, and we will discuss these as we proceed. Although first, we would like to stress that when we speak of games and game design elements, we are treating them as ideal types. That is to say, we're sure that many viewers may be able to imagine examples of computer games or analog games that trouble these observations, as well as that very distinction. But the aim here is not a nomothetic classification system, but an ideographic heuristic. We hope to get us thinking about what different sorts of games owe to each other and what the consequences of those differences are for the institutions that use them. After all, today's analog games are themselves already remediating digital game elements, although consideration of this is beyond the scope here. So to explore some of these observations, we turn to Death Stranding.
This is Death Stranding from Kojima Productions, 2019. Came out right, I think, maybe at the end of October, beginning of November of 2019. It's sort of oddly prescient, right after, of course, everyone went into lockdown for COVID-19, and that's sort of a reoccurring theme in this game, although clearly, did not really have anything to do with it. So this game tells a very complicated sci-fi story, but we're not going to try to get into that. We're actually going to do our best not to get into that. What we're really looking for here is to focus on a few of its core mechanics and interfaces, or the ways that it presents itself to the player. So just as, we're thrown into this post-apocalyptic world, we're also thrown into this implicit process of pattern and contingency here. Rather than learning the mechanisms of contingency through setting up a board game, say, we're thrown into this one, and we just sort of have to test things, right? We learn by doing. We move our controllers to see exactly how we maneuver in this world, right? We're not only inhabiting a character in the video game, but we're inhabiting their body. The mechanics of the game. So if you're not familiar with Death Stranding, one of the largest sort of, the main feedback loop is the process of moving all of these crates that you see me carrying on my back from one node to another. And this is done primarily through walking. Sometimes walking can be very slow. You can actually sprint a bit if I remember my controllers. But doing so, you risk falling over, damaging yourself, and damaging all your cargo. And that's sort of the thing that is most important in the game. That's what you get credit for. That's what you get evaluated on, is how well the packaging holds up and how quickly you can make your deliveries. You can't necessarily see my controller, but holding either the left or the right thumbstick causes Sam, the player, played by, we saw earlier, Norman Reedus, causes him to shift his weight to the left or the right. And that's essentially the main gameplay loop there. Either walking and needing to shift right or left to avoid falling over. I'm playing sort of a late game. I'm playing sort of a late game save, so I'm a little bit leveled up. But there we go. See, I'm almost falling over. I had to stop and sort of catch myself. As one IGN reviewer called the experience of playing this game, something like trying to push a wheelbarrow full of bricks up a flight of stairs, right? It's a very sort of tedious, slow-moving game that asks players to, really just sort of slow down and inhabit a body that doesn't have superpowers like we see in most games. As we saw, as Thomas was talking, a little bit of footage from a safe room. This game is very self-reflective. And as you can see through the TV ad for Reedus' show on AMC, as when he went to the bathroom, there's lots of breaking the fourth wall moments. And even the slow anti-ludic mechanics of walking around produce sort of a reflective aesthetic, right? Speaking from an MDA point of view. But we want to emphasize the video game is architecture. And I think Death Stranding makes a particularly fruitful example to talk about this. So video games and their makers are literal space-making institutions, right? Although the space might not be literal, it might be quite virtual, but it is a space-making institution. Death Stranding makes lots of references to institution. Bridges, which is sort of the main, the main institution that you work for, that gives you the quests to deliver these packages, but also the post-apocalyptic United States, which is called the United Cities of America, which is sort of this goal. We're trying to reunite America. But the narrative makes no clear distinction between those institutions. Bridges is, it seems, itself and the United Cities of America, at least as far as institutional organization goes, like secession, right? One of the main characters of the game, one of the main non-player characters, I should say, that is part of Bridges, sort of ends up in charge of the United Cities of America just because. There's really no explanation there. There's a blurring of lines. Right. So the way it makes space. Let me show you our menu really quickly. So as you're working for Bridges, essentially, you are tasked with not only delivering packages like a UPS driver, but also hooking up this sci-fi internet that they call the chiral network. So you're a little bit Amazon, you're a little bit cable guy. As you go into spaces to expand Bridges' reach, right, through the chiral network, Bridges starts giving you more affordances in order to traverse this terrain. Some of that can be seen here, such as, well, ropes. Sorry, I don't have any ladders. I probably should have made sure I had ladders. Ladders, ropes, bridges, whatever you need to traverse these, often, as you can see, mountains that you need to get up and down, ravines that you need to cross, and whatnot. A consequence of looking at games like this in terms of architecture and as space-making institutions is that we can frame the game's design and players' actions as strategic versus tactical actions, right? Taking it from Desarteux. I think of this game quite a bit as a game about situational adjustments. So let's go back to the menu really quick. Let's assume that I've been giving given an order to deliver, I can use the ever-present affordances of bridges to make myself a little, this way kind of map. Actually, maybe I should do it for myself. Sorry. Apologies. I'm trying to play on a screen that is tiny. Okay. So here we have a marker that is telling us how to get to the place that we need to go, right? Even though that's sort of arbitrary. I just made up that place. But as we can see, this is taking me straight to the face of a mountain. What I find most often while playing this game is while I'm marking out territory and moving from place to place, I find myself needing to diverge from the path that's been laid out for me, right? In order to go around a mountain, in order to just sort of skip some easy rocks, right, that I just don't want to walk through. For instance, let me just walk over here instead of tripping all over those rocks. But I'm always using that line to keep myself somewhat situated in where I'm going, right? I'm not losing my complete sense of space because this institutional line is sort of keeping me moving in the right direction, at least. I'm also provided this scanner. And I think the scanner is honestly one of the most interesting parts of this game for me because it layers on this level of digital landscape on top of an already digital landscape. And the way that I think one of the results that has for a player is that we start seeing that originally digital landscape, what we're looking at now, is a little bit more real once we add this hypermediacy of another layer of data on top of it, right? The digitation of the landscape in a way naturalizes the already digital landscape for us through the type of metonymy, a slippage of semiotics. It's a hypermediation that causes our attention to shift to think about the landscape not as a pretty picture, but as a really rocky riverbank or deep and shallow water. Of course, this example hinges on a certain amount of the player's suspension of disbelief about that landscape in the first place. But when this process happens in a more complex and often obfuscated systems, we may be less likely to critically evaluate the sort of naturalization of a video game's doxic givenness that we intend to address today. So, in a lot of ways, I think this digital landscape sort of serves as an algorithm, which is Alexander Galloway's term for sort of allegory and algorithm, for what Martin Dodge and Robert Kitchen call code space. And that describes a blending of material and virtual to produce a new kind of space where code not only augments, monitors, or facilitates, but regulates and controls. And their real life example is that of an airport. I think Death Stranding blends the architectural parameters of the game, the material, with the diegesis of bridges, which is virtual, to create a code space in which one's relationship to place an object is not simply determinative, but there's an implied stochastic element to it. And that takes us to this last sort of affordance of bridges and of Death Stranding as a game. So Kojima, the game designer, was really interested in the feeling of loneliness in this game. So Sam here, poor Sam, is usually wandering the mountainsides alone from place to place, right? He's sort of an outcast of society who have taken to living in these small cloistered cities. But Kojima started something that he wanted to call the Strand system. And that's the idea that every single player game that's hooked up to the internet will also sort of bleed into other single player games. And I'm not necessarily seeing... Actually, there's some over there. Let me get over there. You could see on my HUD in the distant horizon, all of these structures were left by other players that aren't necessarily in my game world. It's not a multiplayer game. It's still a very single player experience. But there's still this social aspect to it, right? And what's interesting is that although the game tells me that I can not only count on this and that I should contribute to it, it hides a little bit about the ways and hows in which this works, right? It's somewhat random what items are shared between players once you've spread bridges into an area. The game sort of gamifies the labor depicted in the game It gives you scores for metrics, such as damage to the cargo, the amount of time it takes. Everything is tracked. Everything is scored, and you can give likes to other players, and those also increase scores. So this player's whose name I can't quite read, I can just sort of hang out and give them this type of currency that I don't really know what it does, right? No one really does. It just sort of increases your score, whatever that means, which gets you better at being a delivery person for bridges, right? So I've written before about Death Stranding and the way that it shows how through an attentiveness to these phenomenon of remediation, video games are uniquely adept at presenting players with opportunities to challenge the reflexive acceptance of this type of doxic givenness. And we hope develop a certain disposition to questioning the naturalization of arbitrariness that they can take with them out into the real world. I've written before about the experience of playing Death Stranding as a ritual of precarious labor. The game mirrors, through some of the ways that I discuss here, digital platforms like Uber, Amazon, and etc. Through enacting the ritual, a player disposed in such and such way to thinking systemically might be led to reflect on the representation of labor that they are performing and the systems in place that necessitate it and profit from it.
That was great. So as part of my attempts to answer questions about how we may best understand games for our research, I have found myself drawn more backward in our scholarly conversations, if you will, than forward. And most often that has been to scholarly treatments of ritual and performance. As I've discussed at length elsewhere, anthropology's long, fruitful approach to ritual can serve as a paradigm for how we may best approach a different cultural form, that of the game, provided we are ready to acknowledge them as peers, in a sense, ontologically on a par with each other, and perhaps with a third, bureaucracy. While ritual and game differ in key respects, one of the great virtues of anthropology's approach to ritual has been how it long ago decoupled the handling of particular ritual events from any determinate effects on participants. In short, anthropology treats rituals as fraught and provisional projects, any instance of which may succeed or fail. In J.L. Austin's terms, we separate the illocutionary force from the perlocutionary effects. Now, games share this quality of possibly succeeding or failing, but with a distinct and explicit commitment to producing such contingencies. That is, the uncertainty of their outcomes is part and parcel of what makes games games. What is more, Clifford Geertz and later Edward Schieffelin drew anthropological attention to how ritual, as a cultural form, can verify institutionally sponsored claims about the really real through its performance of cosmic orderings, performances that take place concretely in the midst of the messy everyday. This performative construction of reality was, as Schieffelin stressed, not simply a matter of powerfully imparting symbolic information. It was accomplished through the tangible realization of an account of the world as an active process of creation by its participants. As Schieffelin makes clear, the constitution of the really real, almost always a project of a sponsoring institution, occurs along several dimensions, but the one to highlight here is the dialogic dimension. As has been mentioned, the line between ritual and game is not absolute, and one way in which it is blurred is illustrated by those rituals which make performative demands on their audience, much like games do. Now, this is common in rituals with the element of spirit possession, as when a medium becomes possessed by a powerful spirit. Such a spirit can perform cures of ill community members, give instructions on proper observance behavior, or provide clue-like information to participants. One such example that Schieffelin explores is from the Kaluli of Papua New Guinea, and is about something rather high stakes, at least for them, the whereabouts of lost pigs. Because they are the most valuable and significant things in Kaluli life, spirits, through mediums, become an opportunity for Kaluli to discern where a precious creature may be found. So what happens is the audience is collectively interested in identifying where a pig may be, but the medium, that is the spirit possessing the medium, gives information that, as Schieffelin puts it, is precise and ambiguous, right? So the message from the spirit may be something like, the pig may be found where two streams meet. And then the audience is trying to make sense of what that precise but ambiguous information might mean and combining it with other information and performatively arriving at a truth for them about where they may find the lost pig. Schieffelin concludes,
Understanding what is happening here is more than a matter of showing that the seance provides a logically and symbolically plausible resolution for a problematic situation. It is also necessary to show why the Kaluli accept what they see in the seance as a convincing, even compelling reality. The question addressed here does not concern the content of Kaluli spirit beliefs, but how these beliefs are brought to life and galvanize a social reality. They are brought to life through the performative construction of reality by the audience of the ritual in dialogue with the medium. This co-construction of reality, achieved through the contingent, game-like performative action of the audience, mirrors the discovery of the truth put forth implicitly by the games we've looked at today, but it does so with a twist. That is, if we take a moment and consider, as an ideal type, no longer the ritual performer and audience, as was Schieffelin's reference point, but instead this encounter between a single digital game player and a game, we can wonder to what extent these roles have been, in a way, distilled and reversed. The player is both audience and medium, in a way, delivering precise and ambiguous truths through their performative actions while also piecing them together into the real. The player does this through practice. The emerging ability to act reliably in the world is coincident with realizing its set of relationships and meanings. Usually, these meanings bear at least a strong resemblance to what the game designer may have intended, but of course, sometimes they do not. But the point is that, in contrast to ritual, games place contingency and the challenge of performative action center stage. They constantly generate, as a matter of course, the performative challenges that Schieffelin saw as constituting part of some ritual events. Is it the case that, in contrast to games with hypermediacy of their game design elements, hypomediate games at least potentially expand the suggested scope of their reality? Just as Take Back Illinois implicitly constructs, through its architecture's encounter with the player, a reality claim about Illinois itself. The game designer, perhaps initially imaginable as the performer, has mobilized game remediation to diminish the signaling of contrivance, to bring the map of constraints and contingencies into as much alignment with the unbounded maplessness of our experience of more naturalized contexts.
Great example of the ways that games remediate through interfaces. Here we have three interfaces that we're looking at, right? We have a computer with a keyboard, we have a radio, and then when we slide over here, we have this nice microfilm projector, right? And part of the goal of the game, part of what it is to play the game, is sort of a circuit between the three. I'm getting information from the computer that I put into the radio that I then put back into the computer, and then I go look it up in the microfilm projector. What's interesting about this game is the ways that attention can be drawn through the mediation of the machine into its content that it's remediating. And when that happens, our sense of that first mediated interface becomes immediate, right? It's a hypomediacy because of our attention into what is being projected. We start to lose focus on what it is exactly that, I should say, how we're getting to that content. So, really briefly, I just want to talk about the ways that we control these things, right? Just if you've ever used one before, you have a forward and a backward scroll. You can rotate the image with this knob. This little knobber lets you move it around, and then we can zoom and focus with these. So my contention is that once the game gets us to stop thinking about exactly what we're doing and why we're doing it, what information we're looking for, these movements with my mouse on this controller become less apparent to me, right? I'm simply just moving the content of this machine as I would if I were actually using this machine with this little knob here. I can't necessarily use my mouse, right, on the thing itself, but I'm stuck with the affordances, the remediated affordances of this interface, of this remediated interface. Not to get too far into it, but we've been talking a lot about attention, right? And I think Catherine Hales can help us out a little bit here, right? I see the difference in attention being one of hyperattention versus deep attention. Hyperattention is this idea that I really need to, utilize all three of these in that circuit that I was talking about, right? I'm using the radio, but I need to be thinking about how to put in the code in the computer. But with deep attention is when that interface disappears, and I'm focused directly on the content itself, and that is what is causing, for me, the remediation of this machine to become really real. And I think we'll turn it over to question and answers. Unless Thomas.
Sounds great.
All
Yeah,
right.
that sounds great. I'm going to hop over to Discord then.
Fantastic. I will meet you there.